Surprise, surprise, surprise. Good to see our visitors with us today. We appreciate that so very, very much. Good to see Megan's grandparents here, Robert and Arlene Hartrider. Good friends of ours, good godly people, and love and appreciate them so very much. And glad they're visiting with us, but I think it's really those two great grandbabies that have brought them our way. If you're wondering about me being up here, you know that we just came from a week's serious studies out in Dahlgren, Illinois, near Benton, Illinois. Jerome was working very hard this week. He was leading the singing during the devotional periods, working hard all this week, getting lessons together, and I said, Jerome, take a break. And Mike and Rodney agreed to that, and so we're giving Jerome a break this morning. He's, for those of you who came to hear him, come back tonight. He'll be up here in this pulpit tonight. We look forward to that. Also, Luke Capps went with us last week for the first time in this preacher's camp. And as I was telling some people earlier, if we had given out a rookie all-star award, it would have been to Luke Capps. He did a phenomenal job, and we just appreciate him so very, very much. But I want to get into our study this morning. I want to thank Noah for reading from the book of Daniel, first 4 verses there. What I'm going to be talking about this morning is Daniel in Babylon. And we're going to try to make some applications from this, and really make some applications by which we may build our lives upon, because it is a very relevant study. Daniel is in Babylon. And just like we put up on the chart here, Babylon is really a study in contrasts. We're going to talk about how Daniel got there in just a moment. Daniel was a Jew. Daniel spent all of his life, from the time that he was about 14 or 15 years old until he died, in Babylon. A long way from Judah, a long way from his homeland. But nevertheless, he was a servant in Babylon, really a servant of God that just kind of jumps out at us as to how he was able to do that. Do this. Babylon is one of the oldest cities on record. If you want to know about the region of Babylon, you go back to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, and it would have been in this area. So this is where the history of Babylon really finds its origin. It was founded on the Euphrates River. And the river still exists today, about 50 miles from present-day Baghdad, Iraq. And so it was a beautiful and a very prosperous city. It wasn't just just like a little hole in the wall, just people that didn't understand, people had no wisdom. It was a prosperous and a very beautiful city. As a matter of fact, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But when we say that Babylon was a study in contrast, it was. Because while it was beautiful, while it was old, and while it was prosperous, it was also a very wicked city. The culture of Babylon was one that was degrading, it was decadent, and it was something. As a matter of fact, Babylon was so wicked that many times throughout the history of the world, whenever a nation or whenever a city or whenever a people was so decadent and so wicked and so immoral, they were said to be Babylon. It was said to be like Babylon because of the wickedness of the culture and the people of Babylon. Now we fast forward to the New Testament and we find that in the book of Revelation, ancient Rome is compared to Babylon because of its wickedness and because of its immorality. It was said to be Babylon. And so many times when you read in the book of Revelation and you see the term Babylon that's used there, Babylon has fallen, is fallen. It's talking about the wicked city of Rome in the Roman Empire. And the Bible tells us in Revelation 18, verses 4 through 5, John said, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people," that is of Babylon and of the wickedness of that culture. Remember, he's not talking about ancient Babylon. He's talking about the Roman culture that was decadent in the first century. At least you receive of her plagues, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. And so I'm saying that to just simply remind us that Babylon when we look at Daniel living in Babylon, understand that he's living in a wicked and a decadent culture. And when you look at John and the early Christians who lived in the Roman Empire under the persecution that occurred, whether it was Nero, whether it was Domitian, whatever was occurring there, the wickedness and the decadence of Rome was comparable to that which was in ancient Babylon. Now let's fast forward to our culture, the society in which we live. How would you describe the culture in which we are living today, ladies and gentlemen? The culture in which these young people are being raised. The culture in which your grandchildren and your children are being born. How would you describe that culture? Would it be a culture that was more consistent with, let's say, Genesis 1 and 2, when there was innocence in the Garden of Eden? Or would you say it was more inclined to be like Babylon? Or to be like ancient Rome? You know, I probably shared this with you before. I read a long time ago about an old preacher from down south. He was able to take a trip up to New York City. And I'm going to tell you something. You come from the deep south and you go to New York City, you are in for a, what? Culture shock. And this old preacher went up there and he was shown all the sights of New York, and he looked at the skyscrapers, and he rode on the subway, and he walked down Broadway, and he saw all that New York had to offer. And what I read said that evening when the old preacher went back to his hotel room, he got on his knees, as he did every night, and began to pray to God. And in the course of his prayer, he prayed, "I thank Thee, O God, that Thou hast allowed me to see New York City and all its splendor. But more than that, O God, I thank Thee that I didn't see anything that I wanted." And I like that, because it tells me that it's possible to live above the culture in which we are found. We're able to live in a way as to not be affected by the culture. And you know what? Daniel is case in point for such as that. Daniel was able to live in Babylon for all of his life and not be in any way, shape, manner, or form influenced or tainted by his culture. How did he do it? How was it possible? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of give a survey, and a really brief survey of the first 6 chapters, and just highlight some things, because in those chapters Daniel faces something that many of us will never have to face in our lives, not in the way that Daniel did. But Daniel faces 3 tests, and it really is testing his faith, testing his commitment to God. And when you see how Daniel faced these tests and how he came through these tests, then you know what? We're going to learn how that we can live above our culture and not be tainted and not be stained by the wickedness that is about us. Now, to do this, let's go to Daniel. Oh, well, I need to back up here. I told you a while ago I was going to remind you how Daniel got to Babylon. Let me do that. How Daniel came to Babylon is in this way. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon. It was after his father died, he was called back to Babylon, he assumed the throne, he became king in Babylon, and he reigned in Babylon for several years. In 605 also, the Babylonians invaded Judah, and that was the first deportation of captives. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the Jewish children, or 4 of the children of Judah that were carried into captivity. Now, Babylon is not done. Babylon attacks again, attacks Jerusalem, or invades Jerusalem again, and that was the second deportation that occurred in 597 BC. It was at that time that the prophet Ezekiel was taken, and he was in a refugee camp somewhere on the Chebar River, and he began his work of prophesying. And then in 593, Ezekiel begins to prophesy while in captivity. And in 586, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, really marking the end, at least at that time, of the southern kingdom of Judah. But now let's go back to the testing that we talked about. The first test that Daniel encounters is what I refer to as the test that is around the table of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what we need to do is kind of get our hands upon what's going on here. Wrap our minds around this a little bit so that we can understand what's going on. So let's do this by going back to our text in Daniel chapter 1. And I want you to notice in verse 3, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace. Now I want you to stop and think with me about something, ladies and gentlemen. Here were these young Jewish men brought into Babylon, and you know what they're going to do? They're not going to torture them. They're not going to take a whip and beat them into submission. They're not going to waterboard them. They're not going to do anything like that. What they're going to do is they're going to try in their really unique way to make Babylonians out of these Jewish boys. They're going to take these Jewish boys and strive to make Babylonians out of them. So what they do, they take Daniel and his 3 companions, and they basically do 3 things to try to get them to forget God, and try to get them to forget their Jewish culture, and try to get them to forget their Jewish religion. Now, how do they do this? I'll tell you what they do. They began in the first place to teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Look again at verse 4. That they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So what they were trying to do, you don't talk like Jews anymore. Don't use the Jewish language. Don't use the Jewish vernacular. You start talking like we talk. You start using language that we use. You start reading our literature. Lay aside those Jewish scrolls. You read our literature. And you talk like we do. And so what they're trying to do, ladies and gentlemen, is trying to keep them from speaking the language of God, but rather speak the language of these pagans, speak the language of these unbelievers. And you know what else they do? They tell them in the second place, don't be concerned about the Jewish dietary laws. That's silly. You start eating the food that the Babylonians eat. You eat the food that's fit for a king. Notice verse 5. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. You consume what we consume. You eat what we eat. You drink what we drink. You talk like we do. You read what we read. What are they doing? Don't you see what's happening here? And then in the third place, what do? They give them Babylonian names. Now let's take away the names that honor Jehovah. Let's take away the names that honor Elohim, such as Daniel, God has judged. Or let's change the name of Hananiah from God is gracious to Shadrach, that is command of the moon god. And that's what they do for all of these Hebrew children. They change their names. You know, that may not seem to be very important, but what they're doing is they're drawing them away from their moorings. They're pulling them away from their heritage. You know, Azariah, God has helped, is no longer Azariah, but we'll call him Abednego. That is the servant of Nego. You see what they're doing? What they're trying to do, ladies and gentlemen, is make Babylonians out of them. That's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to get them to assimilate to their culture. Now, what is this teenager? Guys, he's probably about your age. What's this teenager stand up and do? Daniel in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which they drank. He's not going to. I am not going to conform. I'm not going to be what you are. You know, Daniel understood that, you know, dietitians will tell you this. You are what you eat. This is what Daniel understood. I can't consume of the things of Babylon and remain a Jew. I can't do this and remain faithful to God. I'll become a Babylonian if I do these things. So Daniel stood up and he said, no, I'm not going to defile myself with the things that Nebuchadnezzar has set before me. I'm going to be loyal and faithful to God. Oh, that we had more men and women, boys and girls, that had the faith of Daniel in the face of this culture in which we live, that we're permeated with on a regular basis, to just stand up and say, you know what? I'm not going to be part of it. I'm not going to become one of you. I'm not going to talk like you. I'm not going to look like you. I'm not going to do the things that you do and go the places that you go, and I'm not going to eat and drink what you eat and drink. I'm not going to become one of you. I can't help but think of Jesus' teaching on the parable of the sower. In Matthew 13, as Jesus was explaining the parable of the sower, the seed that had fell among the thorns, and he said in verse 22 that it's like, the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and all the things that Babylon is throwing your way. You know what it's going to do? It's going to choke out your desire for God. Daniel knew, if I eat this, I'm going to lose my desire for God. The more I consume the things of this world, the less appetite I have for God. It's that simple. We look around at our culture and we shake our head, we scratch our heads and we wonder, what in the world are we going to do? I'll tell you what you're going to do. If you want to live above your culture, stop plugging yourself into it. Amen. This is the only way it's going to happen. You know, when we feed ourselves on a steady diet of our culture and our society, you know it will not be long that you will not be able to distinguish us from the culture and the society in which we live. We get a steady diet of this every day. Every day we get up, the devil is offering us to sit down at Nebuchadnezzar's table and consume of the delicacies of this world. And the more that we consume, the less appetite we're going to have for the Word of God. I just have to tell you. Just think about what the world is offering to us. The world is offering to us a steady diet, and I'm talking about from the time perhaps that we're small till we get older. A steady diet, television, DVDs, movies, a steady diet of nudity, a steady diet of fornication and adultery and abortion and homosexuality. Schools are giving us a steady diet of evolution. What are all of these things doing? It is causing us to lose an appetite for the immortal Word of God. And we're no longer hungering and thirsting after righteousness. And you know why? Because we're gorging ourselves upon what the world is spoon-feeding us. And then we wonder what's happening to our young people. Why is it they this way? Why did they turn out this way? I'm telling you, my friends, when we allow them to just simply consume the things of this world, have a steady diet of what the world is offering, we ought not be surprised that they have no interest in God, they have no interest in heaven, they have no interest in becoming a Christian. They're filled with the delicacies of the devil. You know, again, Jesus said in Matthew 13 that the cares of this world will choke out the Word, and it will. When you find young people who are more interested in Xbox and more interested in the latest superhero movie, or more interested in the NBA Finals, or more interested in the NFL Draft than they are in the teaching of God, the Word has been choked out. They're not interested. They're filled up with the delicacies at Nebuchadnezzar's table. You want to be able to live above the culture? I tell you, this is the only way. You're going to have to say no to these things. You don't hear preachers talking about it. You don't hear elders talking about it. You don't hear Bible class teachers talking about it. You know why? Because in many instances you've got elders and preachers and Bible class teachers who are consuming the same thing. And they don't see a problem. They're eating at the table of Nebuchadnezzar. How about let's just say no? Just say no. I want to hunger and thirst for God. But I'm not going to do that when I'm filled with the things of this world. Daniel purposed in his heart. But you know what? That was okay for a while. That was okay. You read on in Daniel chapter 2 and 3 and 4, and you see what happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you get on over into chapter 5, and you know what? Daniel faces another test. And this is the test that occurs in Daniel 5, and I refer to it as Belshazzar's feast. Look at chapter 5 and verse 1. Daniel 5 and verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast. Oh boy, I'm telling you, we're going to put on the dogs here. We're going to put on the Ritz. This is going to be the biggest feast that we've ever held here in this beautiful city. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Now they were putting on a feast. Belshazzar now is king in place of Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's probably Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. I know he's very often referred to as his son that is of this lineage. But he's got the same spirit, and he's got the same arrogance that his grandfather had. And it is well on display here. So you've got this feast that is occurring here, and it's just a few hours, just a matter of hours before the nation falls, before Babylon is invaded, and before the king is killed. It's just a few hours before this happens. Now I want you to notice now what begins to occur. It is a drunken, blasphemous orgy that's taking place. Let's notice verses 2, 3, and 4. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. These are the sanctified vessels that served in the temple of God in Jerusalem. Come on, bring these holy artifacts. Bring them in here. We're going to use them. And so they, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Now just imagine. Here's a drunken feast that's going on, and you can just imagine all of the decadence that was likewise associated with this drunken feast. But now suddenly, whoa, God wasn't invited, but he shows up. Now he's going to see something. You know, we talk about seeing the handwriting on the wall. I'm going to come back to this. This is exactly what Belshazzar and his lords and all of those who were there, they began to see. In the same hour, verse 5, that is while they were drinking and while they were engaging in all of this decadent behavior, in the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now look, notice now, in verse 6. Then the king's countenance changed. Right? That means he got a strange look upon his face. And you know what? I bet you would too. Then the king's countenance changed. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosed and his knees knocked against each other. You ever hear that expression? You know, the knees knocking together when you get together. It's from here. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of sayings that we use today that are found in the book of Daniel. He was so scared when he saw the handwriting on the wall that his knees were beating together. What in the world is going on here? I need to understand what this means. I have no clue. And so you know what he does? when he reads what's written on the wall, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, verse 25 reminds us that's what the hand was writing. What's he do? Well, let me call my wise men in here. Let me get all of my counselors. Let me get all of these soothsayers. Let me get all of these, tea readers and crystal ball readers in here, and these astrologers in here. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. But notice, now all the king's wise men came, and they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Why is this? Why could they not read it? Why could they not give the interpretation to it? What's going on here? Here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the thing. They couldn't read it, and they couldn't interpret it, because this is a message from God, and they're not plugged in to God. This is a message from heaven, and they're interested in things of this world. And so long as that's where your heart is, and so long as this is what you're plugged into, you're not going to be able to understand the message from God. And it's that simple. And we shouldn't make it any more difficult than that. If you want to understand heaven, you want to understand the message from God, don't consult the astrologers. Don't consult the people of this world, because they don't have an answer. Now, I'll tell you, they were troubled. And somebody takes word to Belshazzar. There is a man. It's not among the astrologers. It's not among the soothsayers. But there is a man in your kingdom. They can understand it. That's Daniel. There's a man in your kingdom in whom the Spirit of the Holy God. He has the Spirit of God. He's in touch with God. He's in tune with God. And he's going to be able to tell you what the handwriting on the wall is. I got to tell you, sort of reminds me, look around you. Let's be honest. And let me use that term. What's the handwriting on the wall that we see today? Come on, what is it? If you're in tune with what's going on in our culture, you've got to wonder, why is there such vitriol in our culture? Why is there such hatred? Why is there such polarization? Why does the left loathe the right and want to kill the right? Why would somebody say, take the president's youngest son and lock him in a cage with pedophiles? Why would we say that? And why on the right would we say such hateful and despicable things that are being said? Why? What in the world is going on as far as immigration is concerned? And people are just flooding into this country and balkanizing this country. And over 300 different languages are spoken in America right now. And religions of all sorts in here. People hate one another, don't get along with one another, and we wonder about transgenderism. People don't, a man wants to use a little girl's restroom. And what is happening? What is going on in America? Same-sex marriage, all of this stuff that we look back and say, well, it wasn't that way in my day. What is happening? You turn the television on, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and you get all these talking heads out there, and they're telling you what's happening. They don't have a clue. They don't know what's going on. College professors don't know what's going on. They have no clue. But I tell you what you could do. You could go down here in southern Indiana, or you can go to the hills of Tennessee or Kentucky, and you can lift somebody out that loves God and, like the apostles, has been with Jesus, and he can tell you what the handwriting on the wall is all about. We are on our way out because it is righteousness that exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people, and we better listen to the handwriting that's on the wall. That's not what we want to hear. We want to hear people, prophesying smooth things to us, telling us everything is all right, but my friends, everything is not all right. Everything was not all right in Babylon. Everything is not all right. When sin and decadence takes over, when righteousness no longer is found, destruction is inevitable. This is the inscription. Daniel said, you want to know what it says? I'll tell you. This is the interpretation, verse 26 of chapter 5. This is the interpretation of each word, meaning God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Belshazzar, your days are, as a matter of fact, your hours are numbered. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. I'm going to tell you what we need, ladies and gentlemen. We don't need to just stay in a building like this and talk about the decadence that's going on in our culture. I do you a disservice if I get up here and I tell you about all the decadence that's going on in Hollywood, and just like I described a moment ago. And I do us a great disservice if I say, what we need to do is just sit in here and talk about how great it was in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s and all of that kind of foolishness that you often hear. But I tell you, the only answer is for God's people to become the salt and the light in this world and get out of our seats and into the streets, leading people to the Lord. This is the answer. And boy, do we ever need men like Daniel and women who are like Daniel, boys and girls who are like Daniel, and tell it like it is. But it's not over. One more quick point. Daniel faces a third test, and that is when this new administration comes. Darius the Mede is now ruling this part of the world. And Daniel is going to be given authority in this new government. Darius is a delegator, and he begins to divide his kingdom up into regions, and he sets governors and satraps over them so that they can kind of administer what's going on. And Daniel's one. As a matter of fact, it entered the mind of Darius to put him over the whole kingdom. I mean, that's how respected he was. But you know what? Jealousy among the others led to hatred and to a plot. So the governors and satraps, verse 4, sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. Doesn't mean he's sinless. What it means is they couldn't find anything to charge him with. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. You know what? What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to derive some idea, kind of get him to violate his law. But we know he won't violate his law, and so that will put him in a pickle as far as the king. So they talked Darius into getting a statute and a firm decree which could not be revoked, that no prayer could be offered to any god except to Darius. That's pretty egotistical. Nobody can pray to any god, but they can pray to you. And so they knew what Daniel was about. They made this decree, and they knew the commitment that Daniel had. They knew his righteousness would not allow him to comply. So, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed, how? As was his custom since his early days. Remember what he said in his early days? I will not defile myself with the food from the king's table, but I'll do it. Now he's an old man. And the same faith that identified him as a teenager is now still anchored deeply in his heart. I'm not going to do that. And you know, these people knew what he was going to do, and they turned him in. And that's when he was cast into the den of lions. You know that story. These children know that story. All our young people here know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel said, I'm going to pray like I always do. I want to remind you of something. Righteousness is predictable. If you are a righteous man or woman, it is predictable what you're going to do in any given circumstance. Where are you going to be Sunday morning at 10 o'clock? Righteousness is predictable. What are you going to do when you're enticed to do that which is wrong? No, I'm not going to do that. Righteousness is predictable. It's not wishy-washy. It's not hot one day and cold the next. It is predictable. So God, when Daniel prays to his God, what happens to him is that Darius throws him in the den of lions. And he, you know what's going to happen. I mean, it's a given. This is a capital offense, and you're going to be killed. You're going to be eaten alive. But you know what? That didn't happen. He was delivered. You know, they put him in that den of lions, sealed it up. And the next day they come, and you know what? Oh, Daniel, he's still alive. Daniel said to the king in verse 21 when he come to check on him, "O king, live forever." I'm okay. I'm okay. They didn't bother me. You know, C.H. Spurgeon said one time that the reason that Daniel wasn't eaten because the lions didn't like him. He's more grit and backbone than anything else. And there's a lot of truth in that. He had a lot of grit and he had a lot of backbone. And he stood up for that which is right. He passed those three tests. Influenced 3 regimes in Babylon. Nope, as his custom since his early days. Let me, in closing, show you something that I think is extremely interesting. I don't know where you are spiritually in your journey. I don't know. Maybe you've never become a Christian. Maybe you're living the life of hypocrisy. I don't know. Maybe you're weak and you're vacillating. I have no idea where you are in your spiritual journey, but one thing that I know. I know that when Darius had Daniel cast into the lion's den, this was something that was hard for him to handle because he knew it was wrong. And if you're living outside of Christ, you know that's wrong. If you're living the life of a hypocrite, you know that's wrong. And it bothers you, don't it? Verse 18 of Daniel 6, "Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting." This is after he cast Daniel in the lions and he couldn't eat. And no musicians were brought to him. I don't want to hear any entertainment. I don't want to watch television. I don't want to hear the radio. I just want to be by myself. Why? Something's going on. Something's going on in the heart of somebody who is not right with God. And his sleep went from him. He was unable to eat. He was unable to be entertained. And he was unable to sleep. Why? I go back to what Isaiah said in Isaiah 57 and verse 20, "But the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest." If you want to be able to live in a way that you could curl up and rest peacefully in a den of lions like Daniel did, you need to have the faith and the heart that Daniel had, not the faith and the heart that Darius had. What about you today? You need to come to the Lord. Come to the Lord on His terms. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Repent of your sins. Confess your faith in Him and be immersed in water for the remission of your sins. And be raised to walk in newness of life. And if you've begun that journey and somehow, some way, you've gotten off of that straight and narrow, hey, come on back today. Come on back in repentance and prayer. Just be what God would have you to be. Dare to be a Daniel. If you're subject to the invitation, won't you come right now as together we stand in that.